Welcome to Saturdays at 7, Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. My name is Todd Ream. I have the privilege of serving as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review and as the host for Saturdays at 7. I also have the privilege of serving on the faculty and the administration at Indiana Wesleyan University. Our guest today is Sarah Schnitker, Associate Professor of Psychology at Baylor University and Director of the Science of Virtues Labs. Thank you for joining us today, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
You completed an undergraduate degree at Grove City and then graduate degrees at UC Davis. At what point in time along that journey did you know that the study of psychology was in your future, and in particular that you were going to commit your life and your life's calling to the science of virtues?
Well, I was one of those people who figured this out very, very early. Um, so I struggle sometimes when I'm helping my undergrads figure out their purpose and their calling, and because I'm like, it was easy for me. I remember my first semester of college, I had the honor of taking my intro psych class from Peter Hill, who is still a colleague to this day, who's a social psychologist who studies virtues and psychology of religion, and one of the leaders in that field. And so was introduced very early on, and I'd entered undergrad thinking I would go into psychiatry, but very quickly was like, oh no, what's for me is to be a professor. This is the best job in the world. And that semester decided that path. And so I was always exposed to this research that I do, even from that early time, and just became more and more committed to it, and then got the privilege of working with Bob Emmons at UC Davis.
Okay.
And he does a lot of work on the development of gratitude, people's spirituality and faith development, things like that. And so it just was always such an obvious choice for me. It took my
Yeah.
love of science and math and wed it to these philosophical questions of the good life and character development that I really cared about. And so very early on.
First semester, I believe you
Yep,
said.
first semester. I was
Wow.
17 years old.
So you were young for entering college as it was, and then it came in the first semester
Yep,
too.
yep. Before I became I guess, what can you do at 18? Purchase
Yep.
cigarettes, which before that happened, I knew what I wanted to do with my time.
Well, before we get too far into this semester, I may have a couple of first-year students that I would like you to talk with then about that possibility. You can find your calling, and it can be now.
Yep.
So you mentioned his work at UC Davis, and that was the attraction and reason then to go to graduate school there, I assume.
Yes, working with Bob Emmons there. And just there aren't that many people. It's grown since that time, but especially
Mhm.
that time, people who are really looking at virtue development, but also attending to spirituality and religion in the process of virtue development. There's not a ton of folks. And so, and Bob is an amazing scholar, also has a deep faith in his personal life. And so being able to work with him and see how he operates in the academy was just a real blessing.
Yeah. Any authors that you read too who contributed to shaping your vocation?
I mean, it's hard, so many. um, I would say though, some of the theological writers. My first semester of grad school, I read a book by David Bailey Harned on the virtue of patience. He was a moral theologian, philosopher, and that sparked my interest in that virtue in particular and set a course of the last 2 decades of work. The other thing, I just love kind of children's, young adult chapter books. So authors like Madeline L'Engle, just inspiring kind of the imagination and thinking about metaphors for what we're trying to do when we seek the truth. And we do a lot of naming in psychology. When we name things, what does that mean? Um, those are both different types of writing, but two that stand out.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. In terms of that naming, for those who are not familiar with personality psychology, can you say a little bit more about it and where it fits within the larger field?
Yeah. So whenever I say, oh, I'm a psychology professor, people automatically think I'm a therapist, which I am not. I'm like, no, I don't want to actually help people myself. I want to do the research about how we can do this and put it in the hands of skilled folks in different areas. But personality psychology, we're really trying to understand what is a human person and how are people, what is human nature? How are we like all other humans? What are some of those individual differences and ways we might classify people and how they're like some other people? And then the thing that's often lost is just that individual patterning of a person's life and their life story. And that is also within our domain. And so personality psychology is trying to say, what is human nature and what are all the variations on human nature that are interesting and important to learn about? And how do we describe those?
Yeah.
How many are there? How do we measure those things and track them over time? And so there's a lot of popular psychology personality systems out there, like the Enneagram or the Myers Briggs. And oftentimes those have major flaws and don't hold up to empirical scrutiny. And so trying to figure out what can we say about humans and what is going to be accurate information we can share with the world that really resonates with people because it is indeed the way humans are.
Yeah.
That's something we try to do.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So you started your career at Fuller Seminary in
Yes.
Pasadena, California, and then made the transition to Baylor University in Waco, Texas, a couple of years ago. In what ways is serving as a scholar in those two environments comparable? And then in what ways, if any, is it different?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think in many ways, they're quite similar in that both institutions have deep commitments to rigorous scholarship, being excellent in just pursuing truth and understanding and application to make a difference in the world. I think, too, at both institutions, I see them as very mission driven, that they have clarity, the faculty individually, as well as the institution, and kind of up and down from boards to administrators to faculty to students, of kind of understanding what their calling is to do into the world, and that both share this deep Christian commitment to education and to producing knowledge that serves the kingdom of God. And then, and I think, the other thing that's really distinctive about these two is both are very creative institutions. Both, I think, especially if you look in the landscape of kind of Christian higher ed, I feel like both are on the cutting edge of what's innovative, trying to rethink our models, doing things that aren't typically done in Christian higher ed. And so that looks different. I think of those. That's where you start to get into the differences. Whereas at Baylor, right? I mean, we like to call ourselves the really, truly kind of committed Protestant R1 that we have in
Mhm.
this country. So with the Carnegie classifications of being at the highest level of research productivity and thinking about how do we do that intensive scholarship with a whole university, with all the different types of colleges and departments. Whereas at Fuller, it was really theological education that also
Mhm.
was thinking about training psychologists as those who are really engaging with people's lay theological beliefs in therapeutic context, whether it's marriage or family kind of therapy or clinical psychology. And so I think a big difference is just Baylor has the entirety of a university. And I can talk to the chemist down the hall and the physicist and the nursing school. So there's more of a scope that I experience here at Baylor that Fuller didn't have. And I think the other big difference is at Fuller, it was all graduate education. the
Mhm.
8 years I was there. So primarily working with PhD students, but also some MDiv students. Whereas at Baylor, I get to work with undergrads again, and really phenomenal undergrads. And so that's been fun to get back with kind of that early formation of students that I missed a bit.
Helping students find that calling in the first semester.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
If only.
yeah. To date, what would you identify as the most satisfying experience that you've had as a scholar?
That's really hard. I've had many. I feel incredibly lucky to get so many rich, deep, scholarly experiences. I'd say the one that's most salient right now is my work on the virtue of patience. So it was in 2004 that I first picked up the book by David
Yeah,
Bailey Harned and started working on this. And for many years, it was kind of just me. I remember when I started my dissertation, I only had 4 sources on patience, and one of them was Charles Darwin, right? There was really no psychological discourse on patience,
yeah.
even though all of us recognize this as something we maybe are really bad at, but really wish we had. And so I think it's been really satisfying to start to see other people join me in studying this virtue. And the first decade, I feel like it was really slow. And yes, of course, that's appropriate for studying patience. You're going to have to wait. But then, especially in the last 5 years, just so much more interest from other scholars across disciplines, just people starting to come together and join me in this journey of understanding what is patience, how do we cultivate it, why is it necessary, what does it look like on a daily basis, and how does it even solve big problems like religious polarization or things like that. Actually, just this past month, we started kind of a second grant on the virtue of patience funded by Templeton Religion Trust, bringing together philosophers, theologians, religious studies scholars alongside the psychologists to really make some concentrated headway with a lot of intentionality. That's been really fun to see. It's been a very slow 2-decade process, but to see, oh, maybe in 2024, after some serious time, I feel like we're actually getting somewhere and
Yeah,
projecting to the next 5 years what will happen. It's going to scale up
yeah.
exponentially with the plans that we have. So that's been super exciting and just personally meaningful as well.
Yeah. No, that is exciting. Along those lines, one of the first articles that I read of yours had to do with the application of your earlier research on patients
Yes.
when it comes to, say, one's calling or career for junior faculty as well as senior faculty. So, those who've committed themselves to the academic vocation. What advice would you offer stemming from that early line of work that might be of benefit to them?
Yeah. And we're even continuing that right now. Where a lot of our current working on patients is really thinking about patients in goal pursuit. That if we have long term goals, which for many, I mean, for faculty, these are long term goals. Like, what can I actually produce? It's often right getting tenure 7 years, and then this, and I mean, there's just a large time scale. I think some advice I would have is, when I talk about patience, and we find that when people are patient, they actually exert more effort and have more success in their goal pursuit. Something that I think we need to do as faculty, and I know I'm trying to always remind myself, is to think about the really big picture of why this matters,
Mm,
right? With patients, we can also get stuck in the day to day, the annoyances, the interpersonal stressors, the things that feel like are inhibiting us. But I think when I'm having conversations with my colleagues, being like, what is the thing you want to discover in the next 30 years? What is the big thing that we can only do all together that is not just about getting this paper out the door, but what is that difference we're going to make in the world? What is the mission we have? And what is the mission you have for your scholarship? And that keeping that big picture in mind, that why am I doing this, is really energizing when it comes down to the how.
Yeah.
And it like, okay, so yes, I will submit. And I think my count of paper, this point that had to submit to the most journals was 9. 9 different
Yeah.
journals, right? We keep trying, and especially early career faculty, and like, just because it's rejected doesn't mean it actually isn't good scholarship. It just
Yeah.
needs the right home. And so just that patient, but it's hard when you're like, oh, I'm going up for tenure review, or I'm going up, I got to get this. And so just keeping that long view and patient industry, and celebrating the rejections. The rejections show you're making progress and that you're actually trying something difficult and original. And so it's not going to be easy.
Well, and sometimes when there's only, say, 4 sources in a literature review in one's project, finding that home for it,
Exactly.
creating that home actually in some ways is quite difficult.
Mhm.
And so, yeah,
And I think, right, learning to, and I think this is true of a lot of scholarship in psychology of religion, or this work on virtues of how do I translate this into the language of these different subfields?
yep,
What is a language this audience will understand?
mhm,
Um, and how can they hear this and integrate it into what their current schemas and ways of thinking? Doing that kind of cross-cultural communication within psychology, between psychology and philosophy, or whatever these other disciplines
yep,
is, it's really hard to learn, but it's
mhm,
really essential,
yeah.
for this when you're solving the big questions of life, or trying to make a little dent in what's been going on for millennia.
So, patience then fits into this sort of larger concept of self-regulation.
Yes.
And this has been part of your work, since the very beginning. And as you just mentioned too, it's going to inform your work going forward here,
Yeah.
and into the next year and subsequent years. What is it? You use the term energizing. What is it about this particular exploration that energizes you and perhaps has energized you back to maybe that first class that you had?
Yeah. We think about anything that humans are trying to do that's important in life, whether it have a strong marriage, build spiritual disciplines and connect to God, whether it success in a career to achieve career goals, or to make a difference in the physical environment. I mean, things that are long lasting and important to work on our mental health, they all require regulation. We are
Mhm.
goal seeking, goal pursuing species. And what we know though is that humans really struggle to regulate themselves, right? And I think, oh, all you got to do is like try to fast a little bit for Lent or for some other time of year. And you're like, whoa, this is really hard to do the thing, to delay the gratification, or to do the thing I don't want to do, or stop eating that piece of chocolate cake, or whatever, right? This is really challenging. Always love when St. Paul's like, the things I want to do, I cannot do. And what I do, right? I mean, this conundrum is such a human problem. But we know some really interesting things from psychology that can help us. And that sometimes if you're trying too hard, it actually can backfire. And that this is actually a really complex process. And thinking about if we want to enhance our faith development, our marriages, our human flourishing, right? All the different things that matter. This makes be a core competency that if we can understand it better, look at how we regulate in different types of contexts, how we can improve it, that this really enhances human flourishing, and that this can have far ranging effects across so many domains to kind of build the good things. And also, if we look at a lot of the problems we have, like our polarization in politics, like Is it because we have our phones and we tweet whatever we feel like, or do it like, right? So many of these things that, like, yeah, I know I shouldn't have done that. What if we could learn to inform ourselves and test out what works and what doesn't, and figure out how to do this all together just a little bit better, can make a huge difference.
In terms of tweets that maybe we shouldn't have sent out, we live in a culture where it seems the illusion of fame is one post away, or satisfaction is one purchase away with same day shipping. So, how is it that you persist then with this line of research when it seems like the culture is moving at an ever increasing rate in the opposite direction?
I mean, I think there's good news and bad news, right? So a lot of sides are like, oh no, where are we going? Things are accelerating. But I also think that when you have this kind of cultural moment where things are changing quite rapidly, I mean, in my own lifetime, how our technology has changed is wild. And I think it also allows for an opportunity to reassess and to take note. And like every other technology that has come through, kind of in the course of human history, there's a lot of risk, right? I remember like we read about like when the novel was invented. The very same things we say about like social media today were said about the novel, like, oh, this is going to lead to social disintegration. People aren't talking to each other, they're just reading all the time. But then we also know there's immense capacities that can be built with the
Mhm.
novel or with our new technologies today. And so something I've tried to do in my work is think about, okay, we have some serious risks with the increasing pace with these new technologies, but how can they be redeemed? How can they also be assets to us? So even thinking about like spiritual development, there's some really cool apps out there, right? That we know technology can actually help you because it's momentary feedback or momentary assessment. There was one app called Soul Paul. And I think it's still out there, like, helps you understand when you feel spiritually connected and when you feel
Hmm.
close to God and when you don't. And we actually learned things. Researchers looked at that and said, oh, sleep matters and this matters. And people can see their own data. So I think there, in my lab, even we made an app called Character Me a couple of years ago. We're trying to build patience through the phone. And so I think to me, it's just another interesting challenge to think about what we do, that there are new risks being introduced, but the very cause of some of those risks also might be where we can find some of our solutions to help pivot things. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I'm optimistic, but I mean, I know the risk is there. And I think that's why I'm so motivated is like, we can't let this just go the way it will go naturally. That as scholars, we need to step in and say, what can we do to make this redeemed? Things have a tendency to be broken and to cause harm, but they don't have to. And um, right, as a Christian, just we know Christ's redemptive work can imbue all things. And so looking at these cultural moments, try not to be too reactionary, but really to think about what is the opportunity and how can we learn from that?
Yeah. Thank you. Now, moving from sort of talking about your research to how you go out organizing it. Your work is organized then in the what you call the Science of Virtues Lab, which
Yeah.
I would encourage people to look at the webpage for that. And it's organized in roughly what I identified as sort of five initiatives or domains. And one of them has to do with the mechanisms that make
Hmm.
virtues possible, religious communities, participation in sport, technology usage, so what
Hmm.
in part what we were just talking about, but then also relations between members of groups. How did you come to organize something so large, and how do you keep people, whether it's colleagues and graduate students and undergraduates perhaps even, yeah, engaged in the participation in this because this is a large endeavor.
Indeed. Then I think it probably needs to even be updated to organizing system. I think, and these are not mutually exclusive by any means, right? The mechanisms we might look at in those other categories listed in, I think a lot of these, we're trying to think about like what are areas where there's consistently work happening. Some of these categories are really thinking about particular types of context where virtue development takes place that might be distinctive. So, like religious communities or athletic context or technology, if we think of online as its own unique context. So, in the model, kind of the theoretical approach I bring to virtue development, it's really, right, what is the story the person tells, but then what habits does an individual have and how do they kind of have this big picture purpose connected to those habits? But then it's also about that dynamic relationship with their environment, right? We aren't virtuous in a vacuum, and that the environments we're a part of really matter. And so you look at like some environments, it's really hard to not be virtuous because the social context, people are already acting that way. There's norms that are set up. The system is virtuous in itself and like you have to work hard against it. But other contexts, we see the exact opposite, right? We see the norms are really immoral, that there's this cutthroat nature that leads people to cheat. I mean, right? You can see these spirals of individuals in their community. And so some of this organization, I think about specific contexts like religious communities or athletics or technology, it's really to think about what are the specific affordances and risks of these contexts and how, and these are all potent ones. Our tech influences our lives. Religious communities can lead to some of the most amazing human goodness that we see, and also some of the opposite, some of the biggest
Yep.
atrocities in human history. And then technology, right? We all know it's affecting us greatly. So, what is going on in these particular contexts for virtue development, and what kind of interventions might need to be particularized to those
Yeah.
contexts? And then I think with the relations between different types of groups, in psychology, intergroup relation, we just see over and over again that sometimes people are really willing to be kind and generous and virtuous with people they consider within their group. But then you have someone who's considered the other, the outsider, right? We even think
Yeah.
about the story of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, right? But suddenly, oh, I behave very differently. And I think when we think about virtues, we want to make sure that it's not just for me and my own,
Mhm.
but for all of our brothers and sisters around the world and
Yeah.
the whole human race. And so that's really essential to think about what's going on between groups and also in as within groups. And is there really virtue if it's only to people I already have an affinity toward? So yeah, so we have kind of this mechanism, which the psychologist in me loves. What's it's really at work here. And then these three particular contexts that, and a lot of times too, I've gotten into these because of collaborators I've been blessed to have in my life and just interests, but also these are potent contexts. And then looking at the intergroup contact and making sure our virtue really is towards our own community, but also towards others. Yeah. So that's the organization. And yeah, how do we keep all this coordinated and moving? I ask myself that question every day. Like, what? How are we doing this? I have amazing staff and colleagues. Right now, I have 4 people with PhDs working under me in the lab, and grad students and undergrads, and 3 staff members. Right. So, a lot of excellent team members who are incredibly talented, and also many, many colleagues across Baylor and other institutions and across disciplines. I'm very much a fan of team science and interdisciplinary work, and having the humility to realize your own discipline can only get so far.
Yeah.
That we've got to do work that bridges discipline, even if it is going to be tougher, but that the payoff is worth it.
Right. Thank you. One of the things that I appreciated the most about the work that you and your colleagues have done as I reviewed it was that it's not limited to the academy. You've made a mark in the academy. I mean, there's not just four sources, for example, on patients anymore
No,
out there. So if someone who's coming along is going to have to cite more material,
indeed.
um, not only your own, but also the work that it's also inspired, but that it has a reach into other communities and other components of the public. So when you're looking at the work that you're doing and you're preparing it for dissemination, how do you decide then with whom you're going to share it? And as you were echoing earlier, how do we communicate those themes, those ideas in ways that that particular public can appreciate and understand?
One thing I've tried to do over the years, and again, I always have a team on any one of these projects because I find often some of my colleagues, my scholar colleagues, are better at some of these aspects than I am. We're really trying to engage the practitioner or the
Mm.
end user of this knowledge from the get go. So, for example, we had a grant a couple years ago where our own team, but also other teams of researchers were trying to create virtue interventions for adolescent in out of school time activities. And so often in science, in psychology in particular, our traditional model is we develop an intervention based on theory, we test in the lab, then we start taking it out into the field, and people should just want it. But often by the time it gets there, it's got some serious flaws that make it not usable, or it's not really meeting a felt need
Mm.
that people have. And so trying to bring our practitioners into the process a lot earlier and having them be partners in the discovery process and engaged so that we know what they need. We also
Mm.
know what our scientific questions are, but that we're actually being able to design our research so that it meets multiple goals. So it's not just whatever drives my curiosity, but also, oh, this group that is working with these teens, this is what they really feel like they need. This is what works with teenagers in their context. And so instead of just doing an intervention study, tailoring it and producing generalizable knowledge, but also having kind of that pipeline to the end product already in place. So
Yep.
that has been really key. And again, just like interdisciplinary work, it takes a more effort up front because you have more relationships to maintain and you really these relationships matter. Right? You need to hear about what this person cares about and understand that and empathize with them and maintain that relationship and have that deep understanding. And unfortunately, scientists, and I'll say this myself, are not always good at that. So, right, I always look on a team. I'm kind of when I'm working on a grant proposal, I'm like, okay, who's really good at connecting with whatever population we are working to kind of as a have in mind from the get go who this might apply to. Like,
Yeah.
who can actually speak that language and speak science but
Mhm.
who, because I think my feeling is always like, got to get outside the ivory tower. We have to show that we're relevant to meeting the needs of everyday people.
Yeah.
And whether that be in congregations and youth sports, in the parent who they can't get their teenager to get off their phone and have a conversation with them, right? How are we going to really make a difference in the world? And it sounds cheesy, but for our work, we need basic research, but surely we could do our work a little bit more that is ready to be translated.
Yeah.
There's,
No, I like in particular the idea that you have that that's built in
yes,
from the beginning, that we have an idea that, yes, a referee journal article or 2 or 3 may come out of this line of research,
yep,
that is important for others to draw upon, but this population is one that we are seeking to engage and that is part of the plan from the beginning. So we're thinking about what those outlets may be,
yes,
that can help us bridge the gap between where we are in higher education, but meeting them where they are in
Yep.
terms of their daily lives. So, yeah, I appreciate that. In terms of the efforts that you and your colleagues have had, the questions you've sought to answer, is there one for which you think you found a more satisfactory answer than perhaps any others? Like, on this question, we really got it.
It's very hard for me as a researcher because I am never, every good answer should spawn like 10 more questions.
Well, I'll ask the converse of this question here in just a second.
Yeah.
So,
So, yeah. No, this one is very difficult. We have some basic relationships that are really, I would say, pretty well established. Like religion is associated with higher self control. We've replicated this. People who engage in more religious activity, who identify as more religious, they over and over again show greater regulatory capacities. So that would be a kind of, we have a finding and we're starting to get a sense of why that is.
mhm,
Um, but that's so right. So I think we can say, yes, those two things are very much correlated. And we have some ways of understanding why that is, the social context that religion provides, the idea that God is watching you and cares about your behavior. We know there's mechanisms at work there of kind of an all knowing God. I think, though, what eh, so this might even get to your next question, right? Oftentimes it's then moving to the next level of, well, this doesn't always happen this way. So when does this occur?
yeah,
Of the different mechanisms, which ones are stronger? Or for what type of person is it this that's really explaining that relationship? And for other people, here's what's going on. And so I think we've got some good kind of basic associations really established in kind of looking at religious influences, but we have a long ways to go in terms of like cultural variation and kind of for whom and when and how. These
yeah,
are these are the questions that I find more exciting, that get me excited. And, working on teams is hard. Working in institutions is hard. So, like, I can't, like, every day I feel like I say to myself, "Oh, good thing humans are so complex and difficult. I will never run out of things to study." Because on a daily basis, we're reminded of, like, "Oh, they aren't as predictable as we wish they were." Other
yeah,
humans.
yeah. So the question that eludes you then, the one for which you just haven't quite tapped the answer to it yet, but you can't let the question go perhaps too.
Well, I think this is maybe not some, I mean, it's personal, but also as a field. I think we have a long ways to go in really understanding the trajectories of religious and spiritual development from childhood through out into adulthood, of really understanding how individuals change. So
Hmm,
we know we have data on what happens on average across cohorts or what happens on average across the lifespan. But we have some initial studies looking at like that really allow us to look at within this person, this is the trajectory of their faith development. And this person, it looks different. And why does some people go on this trajectory versus this one? Um, and I think part of the reason I find the research we have at present dissatisfying is because you really have to do intensive longitudinal studies. And those are really hard to do, right? You have to track people over long periods of time. And they are expensive. They require serious, like, long-term investment that, well, we won't know for 20 years. Well, right? And they require a really concentrated effort on the part of many, many scholars. And so when I kind of stand back and look at kind of the different kind of psychological study of religion and spirituality and virtues, it's really that lifespan looking at within person change over time. Because I think that's what most of us really care about, right? We really care about and I think as educators in particular, like, what happened to this college student before they came to my classroom? What influence do I have here that could change the trajectory they're on? And we know college,
Yeah.
adolescence, emerging adulthood, these are really critical periods, is what the research does suggest, that can kind of shift what trajectory you're on. But we don't have enough longitudinal evidence to suggest what happened.
Mhm.
And we need, right, there's a lot of statistical things. You need like at least 4 time points to really look at within person change and not just group averages. And so those are the questions that I'm not satisfied at all right now with where we're at.
Yeah.
And I think we have some exciting things happening, but we have a long ways to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Well, the last sets of questions I want to ask you about is the relationship that psychology shares and those who steward that discipline share with the church. One of the things I noticed in your work is that it's intended to sort of bridge the gap between psychologists and clergy and be of service to clergy. In what ways do you sort of build that in, perhaps, to the work?
Yeah.
And do you make these sorts of results possible and usable ways for those who are serving our congregations?
Yeah, no, and it's a challenging task. And I mean, I think one of the ways I do that is by collaborating with theologians,
Mm,
especially practical theologians who are a little bit closer to congregation, but make sure that I think as psychologists studying religion, we can sometimes be a little simplistic in our theology and make sure we're actually taking into account kind of the theological richness that is out there. And so, for example, right now I have a really fun grant with my co-PI, religion scholar Devin Stahl here at Baylor, where we're training approximately 20 theologians, religion scholars in psychological science. And hopefully the flip side is happening too, where we actually can learn to work together in the academy so that our work can stand up to both sides of the equations, that psychologists can say, yeah, this makes sense, and the theologians who
yeah,
are a little bit closer to the congregation, and then work in partnership to go forth into congregations and say, what do people need? What what is the language that makes sense? Because our
right.
psychological language may not be the appropriate language, and oftentimes it's not in the congregation. So, um, again, also using clergy, like if we're thinking about doing something that would go directly to congregations, asking clergy up front, talking with people who are regularly using resources, things like that. So, but I think I really am committed to the interdisciplinary team model and making sure we have theology partners or clergy partners if we're hoping
Yep,
to do that.
yep. This question is admittedly too broad and overly simplistic, but I nonetheless will ask, given the culture in which we live today. But in your estimation, do clergy trust people who are scholars of psychology? And then do scholars of psychology also trust clergy?
Yes and no. I think I mean, those are very, very large, diverse groups. If we talk about
Hmm.
clergy, if we talk about psychologists. And so I think some clergy really do and are excited to partner. Some are more suspicious. I think the same is true of psychologists. Some psychologists are really excited about potentially working with congregations and helping to kind of disseminate the knowledge we have there. Others are much more suspicious. I think, it's often there are some differences in what the makeup of those fields look like. By and large, psychologists are of the academic disciplines tend to lean more secular. And I think, though, a lot of psychologists do have a meaningful spirituality in their life. It might be not traditional religion, but aren't going to be comfortable with the language that clergy are using, and then vice versa. But, I think it's really interesting is that our society has integrated psychology so much into the way we
Mhm.
think about the world, right? And Christian Smith's moral therapeutic deism is
Mhm.
very much prevalent in our church communities. And so I think there's also a sense, as a psychologist, at least I have, of, well, that's like a pop psych version of what psych, right? Like, this is not actually what the literature, like when I think about like the Enneagram, like no personality psychologist would endorse that. So I often am, and I think there's often, right, stereotypes and caricatures across clergy and psychologists. And so I know I'm trying to always say, hey, let's not make assumptions. Let's
Mhm.
not engage in stereotyping the other group, because what you think might not even be what that discipline,
Yeah.
and they might not endorse that at all.
Yeah.
And so I get excited about trying to gently educate and help people engage across what might be a bit of a divide, more so for some than others. And recognize that I think we do have a lot of very similar goals of helping people to flourish,
Yeah.
helping to improve people's lives, and helping people connect to what's meaningful, um, and true and good. And so recognizing that we all have a role to play in that. And that when I've seen psychologists and clergy cooperate, it's been powerful. It can be really fruitful and lead to real change. So I think there is mistrust, but there's also trust that's being built. And I think both sides can do certain things to like be a more trustworthy partner. What I try to do. Probably not
Yeah.
always well, but I try.
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate that. No, I think of, Fuller Seminary being one of those places that has been working at this intersection and
Yeah.
building trust in this way for
Yep.
decades now, and has provided models for others of us to follow in that regard.
Yeah. eh, If I can it's really fascinating when you said that too. There's just a recent PhD grad from Baylor's history department, Skylar Ray, who just wrote a dissertation on the founding of the School of Psychology at Fuller Seminary. I'm sure
Oh,
the book will be coming out, but it really, as I was reading that on the committee, it really struck me that the School of Psychology really had that missionally from the get go, but
hmm,
also had missionally to transform the field of psychology, which I
yeah,
thought was really cool. I really felt when I was there, and that for these kind of efforts to work, both parties need to come
hmm,
ready to be learning and growing and recognizing the value the other brings to
yeah,
the enterprise.
yeah. Thank you. As we begin toward wrapping up our conversation, I want to ask you about preparing the next generation of scholars and what you would recommend in terms of shaping them and shaping their future. You worked with a number of PhD students already over the course of your career. And yeah, what you've learned and what you'd recommend.
Yes. Yeah, I think over 20 at this point,
Yeah.
doctoral students have supervised, which is such an honor and kind of scary too. Like, what have I done well? What have I not? I think I have a couple of recommendations. I think the first would be making sure students know their why. Why are
Yeah.
they doing this? What do they want to do? And in psychology, we have a lot of options. We can go in traditional academia. We can go into industry. A lot of technology companies hire psychologists. Lots of different types of companies want our data analytic skills, our ability to predict human behavior. Um, so figuring out your why, or going into ministry, right? There's a lot of options. So what paths do you see? But really, what is the big thing you want to do across a lifetime? I think for graduate students in particular, they have a lot of acquisition of mundane skills and learning how to write and learning how to read an article and so helping them not lose sight of that big picture
Yeah.
is really critical, because otherwise it becomes demoralizing. They feel insecure, like they're imposter, right? So doing that quite often, I think normalizing rejection as I mentioned earlier, I try to consistently share all of my rejections so that they can see. We have a publication pipeline where we try to show all the papers that are happening and moving and celebrating when my paper has yet again gotten desk rejected, right?
Mhm.
That this is this is not an indicator of quality always. And then I think the other thing I think the academy needs to do better at is really creating positive cultures where people feel valued as human beings. And uh, I think sometimes in the academy, traditionally, it's like you have to prove yourself. And if you put people under threat, they'll perform higher level because they got to show their worth and compete. And I mean, that's just not what our psychology suggests, is that when people feel safe and secure, that's when they're creative. That's when they're take important risks. And so I try to make sure I like tell colleagues, like, just like in a marriage, you need like 5 to 1 positive interactions for every 1 negative one. Like the same's true in an advising relationship. For every critique, I need to make sure I'm giving 5 affirmations for every 1 critique, which can be hard to do because there's a lot that needs to be critiqued early on in a PhD
Yeah.
program. So really trying to find ways to make sure people know they're valued and that I believe in them, and that this feedback is really just about growing together, and it is not to be threat to self, and helping them just have that purpose-based instead of performance-based identity as a
Yeah.
scholar.
Yeah. Thank you. One last question then is, as we prepare that next generation, in what ways can we prepare them as scholars to be of service to the church, and that be part of the public that they perceive is of value to them from the very beginning and part of their formation process?
Well, I think all the back, like, are you doing this yourself? Right, so they see this modeled.
Yeah.
And I think that's the first step, is you should be doing it, and when you're doing it, bring them along for the ride. So anytime I have an interdisciplinary collaboration, even if I'm not required to include a grad student in this thing, I always do, so that they can see how it's done. They can start
Yeah.
to watch us doing it and be part of it. And so I think that model for this particular activity, what we do shows what we value. So letting them see you do this and be a part of it, I think. And also just showing, like, hey, this is part of your role, and your identity. And I have students of different faith traditions in our research lab. So we have Muslim, Protestant, Catholic, Latter-day Saint, people who are spiritual but not religious, but trying to help all of those folks say, okay, you might not be the same faith tradition as me, but what does this look like in your tradition?
Mhm.
And that this is a valuable thing. Is That's not, that message isn't always said. So um, even just saying it, I think, can be revolutionary.
Yeah. Thank you. Our guest has been Sarah Schnitker, Associate Professor of Psychology at Baylor University and Director of the Science of Virtues Lab. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and share your wisdom and insights.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for Saturdays at 7. Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. We invite you to join us again next week for Saturdays at 7.